Did we have a bit that I didn't know about?
I've seen this thing. I don't know what it is. What's the word? A UVO, an unidentifiable visual object, many times in my life, but I have never seen it on a big screen. I've never watched it with other people. It's a real pleasure to watch it this evening. So thank you to Ini and thank you to the staff at the Asia Society.
Thanks to Ine for organizing.
And sort of tumbling in through the streets this evening, kind of laughing, being a bit sort of nervous. You're not sure who's a friend, who's a foe. I couldn't imagine a more perfect occasion to watch this. Still in all, for many people, the idea of horror, Asian horror, would be confusing, would be weird. This is something you spent a lot of your life writing about. What is Asian horror?
First of all, thanks to Ine for organizing. Thanks to everybody for showing up. This is also my first time watching the film with people. And it was transformative. I don't think I laughed as much when I watched it alone. And I think it's something to do with the idea that genre is a collective experience, because it's collectives of film going over decades and decades that have gotten stored in our memory as what's supposed to happen in a film like this. We share this knowledge. This is kind of shared knowledge, right? And so when everybody was laughing because it was taking them too long to go down the stairs and then come back up the stairs, I felt it. I felt that, oh, this is the experience of genre together, where we kind of know what the sequence should look like, right? But it's not quite happening, but we're there. We're so activated by the film, we're trying to kind of help them get there faster, right? And I think that's what the experience of laughter in this room, which is camp or affectionate camp or cult, is. It's this experience of excess, right? Like this feeling that there's both too much on screen and not enough, right? It's both. So excess is always both these things. And I think camp or excess has been the dominant way that South Asian horror has been seen or approached by scholars or preservationists or exhibitors in the West. I'm not complaining. It gives us audiences. So Pete Toombs has been central, and so we want to thank Pete again for making it possible to show the film today, and we're very excited for the restoration that's going to come up. But Mondo Macabro has been crucial in mediating the relationship between South Asian horror and Western audiences. My own work is not on Pakistani horror. I'm not an expert. I am a novice, just like many in the audience. My work is on 1980s Indian horror, specifically Bombay horror, so films made in the city of Bombay in the 1980s. And often when I was doing that work, the first question I got was, oh, were there horror films in the 1980s in Bombay? Yes, there were, and that wasn't the only cycle. There was a cycle of films in the 50s and 60s that's considered Gothic films of the same industry. And so it was very interesting to think about Zinda Laash and to hear the story about it being advertised as Pakistan's first horror film. Because in my period that I'm studying in Bombay in the late 1970s and 80s, there was a film called Darwaza, which was also advertised in papers as India's first horror film. It was not India's first horror film, but it was for a generation of moviegoers, their first color horror film, right? And so I think there's something interesting here about other histories of South Asian cinema that don't look like Bollywood, right? Or that don't look like what we think they're going to look like. That also disturb our idea of what a horror film should look like, right? Who gets to decide what a horror film looks like?
Yeah, and when you were doing your research, was it easy to find the materials? Were they particularly well preserved, or were they especially badly sort of preserved? If it is a genre, are Asian horror films something you don't sort of talk about in polite society? Yeah. Do you watch them in particular contexts?
Everybody talks about them all the time, even if they pretend not to watch them, right? So they're everybody remembers the advertising for horror films when they see them in city streets. Doing research for my project was a long process, as all PhD projects are. But I think one of the things that struck me was how abundant some of the material was. For example, governmental records about the censorship of films. Such films are extensive and well preserved, right? And I just wanted to flag that Saad read out the censor certificate deletions for the film at the start. And I noticed how they're all tagged to the song and dance sequences, right? And I don't know if you noticed, but every time there was a song and dance sequence, the film got much more jittery. There's a lot of damage that's palpable in those sequences. And I wondered if those were the traces of celluloid censorship, right? Because that's where the film has really been cut into and then retaped or kind of put together again. And so in my work on the censorship of horror films, I spend a lot of time with the damage in the film strip to think of it as an archive of state censorship.
Yeah, and in some of those dance sequences, I was really sort of taken by the reaction shots of the women in the room.
Yeah.
And you could see them kind of quite excited or curious or turned on.
Yeah.
And if I was the father of my sister, for example, I would not want her to watch of those scenes because of the kind of the ambiguity of that response. So I'm laughing. But I am titillated.
Yeah.
I am often excited. I am sort of turned on. And I'm thinking, maybe it makes absolute sense. Maybe it's absolutely correct to try and censor this. Because it does feel a bit like a kind of bootleg. It feels, or a liquor, it feels dangerous.
I think vampire films have always been thought of as, and there are many vampire film fans here, have been thought of as films of the illicit desire, right? And there's lots of not even subtextual references here to incest, necrophilia, pedophilia, homosexuality that are kind of displaced onto the idea of the bite rather than the kiss, right? Which is itself a kind of sensorial device. And I wonder if that's not only connected to the idea of camp, right? So queer audiences find this kind of subcultural film very exciting because you see kinds of desires expressed that the normative cinema may not necessarily express. And I feel it's connected to the earliest kind of idea I was trying to share, which is campiness is exciting because it draws attention not only to how the film was made, right? And you kind of have this affection for the effort that's visible on screen, but it also then makes you ask questions about why the convention is the way it is, right? So when you're watching this and saying, hey, why isn't it more like that other film that I like? You're also asking questions about why do you like that other thing more? And is that the norm? So what's this investment in normativity, right? And so there's a kind of, camp has this way to open up both the kind of non-normative desires, bodies on screen, right? But also normative filmic standards and tastes, right? And I feel they're kind of connected when you're watching a film like this together.
Yeah, one of the things that people often say about horror films is that they're a kind of awkward dance between the past and the present, between modernity and sort of traces, dirty residue of the past. And I was thinking about the jazz scenes, I was thinking about some of those great car sequences, the radiograms in the room. And there's a sort of blingy modernity going on. And against that, it's just all of this dirt and kind of murk of the past. You write at times about horror, of course, as a genre, but horror can also be seen as a kind of social document of a particular moment in history. And did you feel that you got a sense of the kind of mid to late 60s in Pakistan from this film?
So one of the things that I loved about watching the film again, but I noticed it the last time I watched it, is there's a scene where Mr. Parvez is talking to the doctor's brother, and he's like, "Ye science ka zamana hai," which is, this is the age of science. 2 minutes later, there's a song sequence where the women sing about this being the masti ka zamana, right? Which is the age of fun, right? And I think there's an interesting kind of tension in the recent post-colonial nations formation around questions of what fun should look like and what restraint or scientific kind of restraint should look like. One of the things I do want to flag for those of you who are fans of vampire films and have watched the classics, Nosferatu, the 31 Dracula, the 58 Dracula, or have read the book, this is an unusual film in that the figure of the vampire is also a professor, right? So it's the question of the modern is put under different kind of scrutiny in a Pakistani vampire film than it would be in a film we've seen in other parts of the world, right? So there's a kind of skepticism around the question of science that's present at the start of the film, whereas in the kind of the Hammer Dracula, Van Helsing is a man of science, right? Fighting the ancient forces, the kind of reaction to the Enlightenment, right? But here, Enlightenment itself is under test, right? Because he starts out as a professor gone wrong. So there's a kind of Jekyll Hyde, Mr. X in Bombay, for those of you who know that film, a kind of contemporaneous film in Bombay.
Apart from the extreme real estate envy I had in the scenes, I was absolutely sort of taken this evening by the soundtrack. And some of it, sort of, you could hear sort of echoes of sort of Psycho, you could hear kind of echoes of a BBC radiophonic workshop. And it just, or something like Delia Derbyshire. It was a really excellent.
Cosmopolitan. Yeah.
What else sort of stood out to you watching it kind of big and enormous this evening?
And I know we want to open up for questions if we have time. I think one of the things that struck me is the opening title card adapted from the novel by Bram Stoker. For those of you who know Murnau's Nosferatu, from 1922 also opened with a title card saying in German, adapted from the novel by Bram Stoker, but we know famously that this foundational text in vampire film history was an illegal adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was a ripoff of the novel, right? And Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, sued. The film was banned. Everything was so not different from Zinda Laash. The film was banned, and all prints had to be destroyed, right? Luckily, some prints had now traveled abroad, and those are the ones that got preserved. And the film became foundational to the history of the vampire film. I mean, the whole convention of sunlight destroying the vampire comes from Nosferatu. It doesn't come from the novel, right? And yet this illegal copy of Stoker's Dracula has ended up becoming the original or the master text of how we think of vampire films. And so there's a kind of way to do a cosmopolitan history of exchange, transfusion, right? Theft, life-sucking forces through the story of the vampire film at different points. And I think one of the things that you hear in the soundtrack especially, but also in the mise-en-scène of the film, is how eager the filmmakers were to show off their musical knowledge, their cinematic knowledge. Right? It's a performance not of purity, like, oh, this is what Pakistani horror should look like, right? But it's a kind of performance within the zone of global popular culture.
Omar Ali Khan, for those of you who don't know, Sad mentioned him. His book is available outside. Runs an ice cream parlor called The Hot Spot. Made a fantastic film called Zibakana, Hell's Ground, I think about 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
Pakistani zombie film. It's really, really good. And he's devoted, for those of you who know the book, hundreds of pages, and basically his sort of life to tracking, chronicling, writing, often really wittily, really acerbically. A lot of Pakistani low cinema. And for him, this is one of the key works that it cinematographically, sonically, a lot of the performances are really, really strong. So we are laughing, and we are sort of laughing at it. But I also, I think we kind of admire it. I think it holds up. You're on those rocky, rugged roads. My heart was beating.
Absolutely, and Omar Khan has a film called Zibakana, which was just mentioned, which was marketed as Pakistan's first slasher film. And in the film, there's a sequence where one of the characters is watching Zinda Laash, right? So this is a long kind of circuit of travel, of films that's inscribed within the text, right? And I think that's very exciting. I think what I like about Omar Khan's work is how cinephilic it is. Yeah, I think the film, what do you guys think? Do you guys think the film holds up? Yeah. I think, and I think there is something about the Gothic horror film that allows for excess of, not only of queerness or of kind of symbolic meaning, but also material form of film to flourish, right? So you don't quite know whether the multiple shadows you see of every actor walking are bad lighting, right? Or kind of a play on the theme of your split self or your multiple. There's something about these lower genres and their obsession with certain themes that allows for formal experimentation that then survives the test of time.
Yeah, the repetition I see is just compulsion, and I always love watching other people's tawdry compulsions.
Yes.
We don't have much time.
Ine, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, we can take a couple audience questions, comments. Let me just run the microphone to you.
Thank you for showing this film. I was really curious what the locations are for, I don't know, like if they were in different cities or specifically in one. I mean, there are very few, as in horror films, locations are. There's just the mansion. I mean, we have a few at the beach and the hotel, but yeah, I guess generally, where was most of the film shot?
Was this a question about locations?
Yeah.
Yeah. Saad, where's Saad? Oh. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Not able to answer the question about locations, but I did notice the kind of the Kabristan that seems to surround the lair, or the kind of this necropolis that's created. There's some recent work that's very good on re-examining the history of the Gothic, which we tend to think of as a European form, actually borrowing from the Near and Far East and the Middle East, right? So borrowing kind of Islamicate form that becomes the substructure of the European Gothic, right? And so some of the domed forms, some of the arched forms you see in the film, at first glance, it's easy to read this as a Pakistani filmmaker's attempt to approximate something that looks like Gothic architecture, but a longer history of the Gothic would actually cycle back to these regions to look for the origins of the Gothic, right? So there's a different way to think about location and dislocation that your question has prompted me, but I don't have an answer to the question of which actual locations.
Thank you.
There's a question there.
Let me just hand you the mic so it's on the recording.
Is the soundtrack available anywhere?
I don't know. I was going to suggest that Sukhdev partner with you, release it on X-rays, like little X-ray record style. Yeah.
Will that be on vinyl as well as digital? Great.
The soundtrack will be released on vinyl and cassette.
There's,
and then we'll go over there.
I believe there's a, yeah.
Okay, I hate to say this. I was rolling my eyes when watching this movie. This is not based on a novel. This is based on Hammer's, The Horror of Dracula, which I've seen a couple of times because they show it's Halloween. Even some of the musical interludes, yes, it's taken from the Hammer style. Though the only original thing was at the beginning, because the scientist turns himself into a vampire, trying to be immortal, is actually kind of, if anyone's, see, I'm familiar with Marvel Comics, and they have a character called Morbius, who's a vampire who becomes a vampire because he's a doctor trying to cure himself of a disease. And this movie tried to pretty much beat that character by a decade. Just my comments.
Thank you.
I was just thinking, what do you think about the climax? Because, you know, we see him very unsuccessfully fighting with the vampire, and then he remembers God, and then there's the ray of light. So I was just curious, what do you think about? Because we spoke about science and professor and, you know, this tussle between religion and... No, I thought it was interesting. But I'm curious, like, you know, you're the scholar.
I don't have a take on it beyond what you just said. I think that the film stages, this is a very normal dilemma to stage within Gothic horror films, which is the force of modernity, rationality, versus some other force, reason, irrationality. And then within this kind of breaking of the secular consensus, like what is the role of God? This is a standard question. This is not an unusual ending to me. It's not that far from A Cross or Garlic or some version of this. There is a great film from 1978 from Bombay called Jadoo Tona, in which there are attempts to defeat the monster using symbols from multiple religions. So there's like a kind of a concert of religious iconography from different religions that's used to defeat the monster. And I think that speaks to a kind of secular consensus in India. Yeah, old India. Yes, the old India, yeah. There's several.
I think it was mentioned that this was in theaters for 3 years.
Days.
3 days or 3 years?
It was my 3 days.
Days. Okay. How was this like received when it was in theater?
I don't know. Saad?
Look, it was either 3 days or a week, but they made this hype that a woman in Multan saw it and died of a heart attack. So it's like corrupting the society, take it off. Yeah.
Which also may have been a promotional story gone wrong.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
This is a very good question. It's like an archival digger's dream to kind of figure out what happened in those 3 days, the 3 days of Zinda Laash. But
I've always read that.
It's short.
Have you read the same things? That it was a relative commercial flop. But I don't know if that's partly because it was yanked off screens and the kind of momentum sort of disappeared.
Can I also say it's very westernized from a Pakistani moviegoer's perspective, even at the time and afterwards as well. It's not, this film is not well known in Pakistan, you know. People were watching like Khatarnak at that time, which was a very sexual movie from the 60s. So that was popular cinema. And in Iran, that would be film Farsi equivalent. So this is like someone who went to Berkeley or something. I don't know if he did, but he probably did, and studied filmmaking and came back, and this is like his thesis film. We have quite a few films like these. Jamil Dalvi is a really great director, and he's made movies which look like Color of Pomegranate. It's the same era, and the Russian whatever filmmaking. So this, from a Pakistani like moviegoer perspective, it's like, I don't know, like it's too westernized in its filmmaking, in its pacing. We have one song in here, which is, you know, we want more songs, and you know.
There's more than,
yeah.
But I do think I invite, if there's any graduate student here looking for a project, please, the 3 days of Zinda Laash would be an incredible project.
Thank you. Okay, we mentioned that this movie is kind of questioning like the role of modernity and science as like the force that's defeating the vampires. It's the force that's creating the vampires. Does that make the innkeeper Van Helsing? Because he's the one who provides all of the information on how to defeat the vampire, and he's also seen as like kind of this backwater, like commercial figure, and not exactly in the realm of science at all. And then also, if this is the westernized filmmaking, but it's also the one questioning the role of modern science. I thought that was interesting.
Again, it makes the innkeeper. I mean, I think in the Hammer horror film, which was the reference, he plays a very similar role across the different adaptations. But I think you're right. There's a lot of condensation that's happening across different characters in different films, and that's why I understand this idea of it reminds you too much of the Hammer film, but not as enjoyable, if I understood you correctly. But I think the point I was trying to make was talking about how every act of mimicry is generative, right? Like every act of repetition within genre produces something different. And I do think there's something different about Zinda Laash that is different than the Hammer film, but that difference is only palpable because it was a repetition, right? It's only in the mimicry that the difference emerges, right? So I think genre scholars and fans are very used to saying this film looks like that film, right? It's the difference, it's that column of difference that's very important for us. I don't know how we're doing for time.
I just have this little bit, if we're talking about science, and the film starts with a Quranic verse, which is Kullu nafsin zaikatul maut, like every soul that lives shall taste death. And I think that sets the tone for the film. Islam has supremacy over science. So you talking about the professor and the Dracula being the same, like this is the conundrum that, you know, the modern nation state probably also had at that time. You know, Islam is, whatever science was telling us, like it's beneath what God has told us in the Quran. So it's even framing the guy who's making the potion, like he tried to do something which was going to supersede divine will, but, you know, he too shall fall.
Yes, and I would be curious to know more about the backstage censorship story of this film, to know if that title card was, at which point in the film's production that title card was added.
It's very normal. Even like very sexploitation movies. Like, I mean, the funny thing is, you watch those movies, you first stand up for the national anthem. And then you have the title card, right? Like you have the censor board thing in India, you know. Of course, there's a censor board thing, but there's also always Bismillah Rahman Rahim or something, you know, some kind of charity thing.
I guess my point was, in what ways the film anticipates trouble by incorporating some kind of disavowal or disclaimer.
This is the best thing about like how under censorship you operate. Life goes on no matter what. We're doing a book called Smut from Pakistan, and in which you see there's this smutty magazines from the same decade, so 60s, and then also there's 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, so two different dictatorships, two different types of like, you know, different types of magazines which are playing with the censors. For example, if the censor is like, you know, you can't show cleavage, so they will have photos with the women with the cleavage, but they will draw with the pen, they'll draw something over it, like a mesh, cross-hatching, sensorial mesh. And what it does is that it even raises the actual charge of the image, but they're getting away with whatever the censor was saying, you know. So you have all these images with really like well-drawn, like cross-hatching, by the editors, and then it goes to the people who see those magazines, and then they do their own cross-hatching. So it keeps on going. So the legs are covered, like you know, whatever is visible is covered, and it makes it even more sexual. So I think to answer your thing, like I think putting the Kullu nafsin zaikatul maut at the top of the film shows that what the intention of the creator. It's also to safeguard your
I think we have time maybe for one more thought. I saw a hand over here, and then we can wrap it up. Okay. Oh, was there someone down there too? Or,
sorry, I just have the mic. Do you mind if I
go
just
for
go?
it. All right, we'll do two more thoughts. So
okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I was just really curious about the archive of the censorship material that you visited, because for this movie, it seems the emphasis is on the women's bodies, but there is still, by virtue of the visual media, a lot to do with men's bodies, like them touching their heart, like wiping their sweat, all of that. And I'm thinking with like book bans and recent comparing it with like contemporary South Asian censorship, which is so neutral in the sense like this is just an offensive text. Versus in that decade, sort of it can be gendered specific. I'm wondering if you found any material that was like anything besides like the female body, or if it was neutral in the sense of like not religious, but something to do with beyond that sort of sexualization of women's bodies given as a reasoning for censorship. Or has it changed in a...
So is this a question about the documents that we saw at the start of today's event?
Yes,
right?
But also in general, everything that you might have come across in your research.
So maybe Saad can speak more to this. This was my first time seeing those documents as well, but in my research around 80s Bombay horror, the focus remains very much on the woman's body. And I just want to kind of circle back to the earlier discussion to say, filmmakers are always working within these contexts, right? So it's not like they make a film exactly the way they want to make it and then it gets censored, right? The force of censorship is within the text always from the start. There's a film from that was made in 1985 in Bombay that was only released in 1988 in India. It's called Veerana. It's the most censored film of the Bombay horror cycle of that period. And you can see the marks of censorship in many forms. So the film tells the story of a female monster. And her earliest attack, you see her stabbing this man repeatedly, right? But the sound on the soundtrack is of somebody punching somebody, right? And it's really interesting because I read that as an attempt to kind of preempt censorship, right? But when I showed it to my students now, they hear that as much more violent than a stabbing sound would sound, right? And so there is this kind of older history of censorship and how filmmakers are navigating it that sounds different to different audiences. I haven't seen evidence of men's body gesture being censored. This would not be necessarily the genre where I would see that kind of censorship, right? The Punjabi action films of the 70s might be a great place to start looking at the archive of censorship of men's bodies. The Dara Singh films, like all these other kinds of examples of male bodies on display might be interesting places to look for censorship of male bodies and their comportment, but I haven't seen any evidence of that in my archive. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Sorry, last question. So when I was watching the movie, we've spoken about how like the professor was Dracula, and that is kind of like an interesting like South Asian twist on it. Another South Asian twist that I realized is that he had to be invited into the house. That felt very South Asian to me. Like the only way the vampire can get me is if I invite him into my house. And I was wondering if there were any other sort of things when you were watching the movie that were like, yeah, that's South Asian culture, but Dracula's doing it.
I hadn't thought of it like that because I think of that as a kind of rule number one of vampires. You have to invite them in. But I like reading that through a kind of etiquette textbook that might be related to certain cultures. This is everywhere. If you've seen Sinners, the new Ryan Coogler film, there's a kind of very beautiful recitation of the rules of vampiredom. One of them is they must be invited in. I hadn't thought of it as Mehman Nawazi. Like that's a very interesting way to trace other cultures within the text.
Because also too, it's just like, to my knowledge of vampire movies, usually it's like a real estate thing. Like that's why the guy goes to Dracula's castle. But it's like, no, I just want to be a guest in his house. And so like I thought that was very interesting. Like, oh yes, like come in, I will feed you.
So this is not my first time watching the film, and you're right, it isn't properly motivated at the diegetic level. But I think we now have enough evidence from the text to assume that he was there on a covert mission. Like, I think that's why he has that diary where he's noting things, and he's a doctor, you know, he doesn't have all that free time. So I think he's on the mission because I think that is connected to the older history of the Hammer horror film. He arrives undercover, right? So I think there might be other ways to think about what he's doing there. Yeah?